He's been the #1 critic of US presidents for more than 50 years. So what does he think of President-elect Donald Trump? In this upfront special, I'll ask Naom Chomsky. Naom Chomsky, thanks for joining me on Upfront. You've witnessed 15 presidents over the course of your lifetime. Is the 16th, is Donald Trump the most peculiar, perhaps the most astonishing choice that the American people have made during your lifetime, in your view?
He certainly is off the spectrum. There's never been anything like him.
In what specific sense do you think there's been nothing like him?
Well, first, for one thing, he has no background at all in any political activities, never held office, been interested in office. He has no known political positions. He's all over the map in his comments. He's basically a showman.
Some are worried that he's more than just a showman, that he's a dangerous individual. Some say that you predicted Donald Trump back in 2010 when you said, quote, "If somebody comes along who is charismatic, this country is in real trouble because of the frustration and justified anger." You said, quote, "Illegal immigrants and the blacks will be targeted," and, quote, "We will be told that white males are a persecuted minority, people will be beaten up, and if it happens, it will be more dangerous than Germany." You sound almost prophetic there. Is that the path that the United States is now on in this new Trump era, what you predicted back then?
Well, I wouldn't compare it with Weimar Germany. Hitler was a sincere, dedicated ideologue. Trump isn't. He has no known ideology other than me, you know. But up to the last phrase, the description is pretty accurate.
But when you have white nationalists like Steve Bannon appointed to the White House as chief strategist, at this past weekend in DC, you have basically neo-Nazis turning up in Washington, DC to have a rally saying Heil Trump. He may not be an ideologue or a neo-Nazi, but clearly he's energizing and emboldening people who are.
Not just in the United States. If you look at the European reaction, every far-right, ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi was greatly encouraged and excited by his victory, thought it helped them. Whether he'll go in that direction, we don't know.
You've spent decades critiquing US presidents. You once famously remarked that if the Nuremberg laws were applied, then every post-war American president would have been hanged. Given the impending arrival of Donald Trump in office, some might say, is it time for you to say, actually, I was a little hard on the people who came before Trump, because Bush, Reagan, Nixon, however bad they were, they weren't on this Trump level of, some might say, insanity?
Well, on the issues of intervention, international violence, and so on, it's not very clear what his positions are. They've been all over. He is in favor of a substantial buildup of the American military. He claims, ridiculously, that it's decaying and depleted. In fact, it's far beyond any military in the world in technological advance, in the amount of spending and so on. But it will be undoubtedly.
He's also said stuff like, I would take the oil, I would bomb the hell out of ISIL, kill the families of terror suspects, bring back torture. I mean, this is stuff that some presidents have done, but no one's ever talked about it as gleefully and openly as this president.
But on the other hand, he's also talked about reducing tensions with Russia, which is probably the most dangerous flashpoint in the world on the Russian border. So it's hard to predict. In fact, the most predictable aspect of Trump is unpredictability. I think it's dangerous, very dangerous, but I doubt that he's...
But just to take a kind of historical perspective, given you've been on the scene watching and writing about president after president for decades now, cast your mind back to the similar period under any other previous president-elect. How worried were you compared to now? I'm just trying to get to a sense of how unique you think this moment is.
Well, it may surprise you, but one of the presidents who worried me most was Kennedy. And in fact, Kennedy brought us closer to nuclear destruction than anybody. Whether that'll happen with Trump, we don't know. But it's certainly extremely hazardous to have an ignorant, thin-skinned megalomaniac who sends off Twitters at 3 a.m. if somebody angered him.
On Russia, a lot of people do welcome a kind of new reset, another reset of relations, an improvement of relations between the US and Russia. You clearly do. But a lot of people might say it shouldn't be done on these terms. Yes, we should have better relations between the US and Russia, but not because the President of the United States may be compromised by his business interests in Russia or because he thinks that the Russian president is a great guy, a strong leader. Vladimir Putin, a man you told me a few months ago when we spoke, he's not a nice guy, horrible leader. You yourself said that. Clearly, that's not the right way to do a reset of relations, is it, on those terms?
It's not first of all, we don't know what's in his mind. I suspect he doesn't know what's in his mind. It's, as far as we know, pretty vacuous. Almost anything comes out. But anything that would reduce the growing and dangerous and severe threat of nuclear war is to be welcomed. It's nice. It would be a nice thing if humanity could survive. A major war between United States and Russia would be the end. And the tensions are developing. Both sides are carrying out provocative acts, military buildups on both sides, close confrontations, jet planes buzzing each other and so on, NATO military operations a couple hundred meters from the Russian border, the Russians putting missiles in Kaliningrad. All of this is very dangerous. Steps taken to reduce the tensions, to turn, in fact, partly return to more amicable relations.
And if those amicable relations involve NATO kind of falling apart, Donald Trump has basically said he's not really interested in propping up NATO, funding NATO in the same way that previous US presidents have. You've never been a fan of NATO. Is that somewhere you find yourself on the same page as Donald Trump?
Well, sometimes he says things that I would say, but for totally different reasons. First of all, he's not calling for disbanding NATO. What he's calling for is getting other NATO countries to pay more.
Yeah.
What he's talking about, in fact, is expanding NATO.
But he's also questioned the whole solidarity concept NATO of coming to the aid of a NATO ally. He has done that.
He said that, and he said everything else you can think of.
So if you were a Latvian or a Lithuanian, you wouldn't be worried about your security or independence under a Trump presidency?
If I was a Latvian or Lithuanian, I would be worried about the buildup of NATO forces on the Russian border.
You wouldn't be worried about Russian tanks coming across the border, given what's happened in Ukraine and Georgia?
That's what might lead Russian tanks to come across the border.
You don't think Vladimir Putin has any expansionist aims independent of NATO?
Not that we know of. There's no evidence for it whatsoever.
None?
None. In fact, even Ukraine. Ukraine was a reaction to what amounted to a coup that overthrew the government. And recall that NATO had actually offered Ukraine, had invited Ukraine to join NATO. That's no...
Your critics would say you're underestimating Vladimir Putin. You're giving him a pass. This is a guy who domestic critics in Russia say is authoritarian, is expansionist, does want to use foreign wars as a way of distracting from domestic crises, just like many authoritarian leaders in the West have done.
People say many things, but I'm looking at the facts.
The facts are he's annexed Crimea. There's no justification for that, is there?
Whether there was a justification or not, no, I don't think there was justification, but we understand the reasons.
It's NATO.
No, it was the reaction to what happened in Ukraine. And for example, is there justification for the United States holding southeastern Cuba? No, none whatsoever. But that doesn't mean the United States is going to immediately go to war to conquer the world.
Okay. So you don't think anyone in those Baltic republics, for example, have nothing to fear from Donald Trump?
They have a lot to fear from the buildup of tension at the Russian border. Okay. If there ever was a confrontation, they'd be wiped out.
Okay. Do you believe, as the US intelligence community and plenty of US investigative journalists have pointed out, that Russia tried to undermine the US election through hacking, through leaking, through deliberate disinformation?
It's possible, but it's a kind of strange complaint in the United States. The US has been interfering with and undermining elections all over the world for decades and is proud of it. So yes, maybe they're doing it too.
Noam Chomsky, on the subject of the media. You've been a long-standing and famous critic of the US media, of the corporate-controlled media, of the way in which it, quote-unquote, manufactures consent for US capitalism, US imperialism. How responsible do you think the media was for Donald Trump's victory, for the Donald Trump phenomenon as a whole?
They gave him enormous publicity, essentially for the reasons that the chair of CBS pointed out. It's great for our ratings. We get a lot of ads. But that's not the most serious thing by any means. The real treachery of the media in this election was to avoid issues totally. Take a look at the massive coverage, huge coverage, practically nothing like it, especially on November 8th. One thing was missing, issues. And in fact, on November 8th, it was pretty dramatic, because actually two events took place on November 8th. One was the American election, the other was the international conference at Marrakesh on survival of the world. And on November 8th, the World Meteorological Organization delivered a study with dire reports on the nature of the climate danger. That wasn't even reported, but that's typical all through the campaign.
And on Trump specifically, and we'll come back to climate change, he's now been attacking the media since being elected. He threatened new libel laws. He hasn't held press conferences during the campaign. He incited his supporters against journalists who were at rallies. Their physical safety in some cases was endangered. Surely even you would stand with a flawed corporate media against a Trump administration that tried to bully or intimidate the press.
Or any other intimidation, wherever in the world. Journalists should be protected. But that has nothing to do whatsoever with the failure of the
Completely
media.
agree.
Okay.
Completely agree. And on the issue of free speech now, in terms of people are worried about the climate of intolerance, what's going to happen to dissent under a pretty authoritarian administration, how worried are you?
Not very. I think there have been, actually I think it was worse in earlier years. There's been real gains in protection of freedom of speech, and I think they're pretty deeply embedded, and my suspicion is that though there will be attacks on freedom of speech, my own feeling is they are not likely to get very far.
And does the rise, there's been a lot of coverage of so-called fake news online, of fake stories that have gone viral. Does the rise of so-called fake news, of a post-truth climate people are talking about, especially online, especially on social media sites like Facebook, does that worry you as an educator, as a public intellectual? How do you combat that?
You combat it by being an educator, by trying to educate and organize and bring people to understand that they should use their critical intelligence to evaluate what they read, whether it's in the mainstream media or on some site that they're looking up, no other way. And it's a bad thing, but I think it can be overcome.
You think it can be overcome?
Yeah. In fact, one really dramatic result of the election, I mean, apart from the fact that Clinton won by maybe 2 million votes, is that among younger people, Clinton was way ahead and Sanders had an overwhelming majority. Now, that could be a positive portent for the future.
Naom Chomsky, we're going to take a break. So who are the people who put Donald Trump in the White House? Is this a revolt of the dispossessed, of the left behind, of globalization's losers? Is it a backlash against free trade? Some of the top voices on the US left seem to think so. But what if the economy isn't the main driver? What if it's racism and racial resentment that helped put Trump in the Oval Office? What if it's the white lash?
Build that wall! Build that wall! USA! USA! Get out!
That's economic anxiety? Just look at the evidence. First off, exit polls from the primaries found the median household income of a Trump voter is well above the national average. And the exit poll from the presidential election confirmed Hillary Clinton won the majority of voters earning under $50,000. In addition, a massive pre-election Gallup study found living in areas more exposed to trade or immigration does not increase Trump support. Second, people of color in the United States, especially black voters, are far worse off economically than their white counterparts. If it's all about income and jobs and trade, why did people of color vote overwhelmingly for Clinton, not Trump? Or does their economic anxiety not count? Third, just listen to what Trump voters actually say about why they support him. One study found that the easiest way to identify if someone supports Trump over Clinton is to ask if they think Barack Obama is a Muslim. It's more accurate than asking them whether they're Republicans. That study also found factors like economic pessimism and income statistically insignificant to Trump's rise. Other studies found a strong relationship between anti-black attitudes and support for Trump, with Trump supporters more likely to describe African Americans as criminal, unintelligent, lazy, and violent, more likely to believe people of color are taking white jobs, with a majority of them rating blacks as less evolved than whites. Do I really need to go on? Oh, but what about all the low-income white voters that Obama won in 2008, but Trump won in 2016? A, there's no evidence that it's the same white people who voted for Obama that voted for Trump. We just don't have that data yet. B, Democrats lost more votes in counties where white income growth was highest than where it was lowest. And C, Obama wasn't running against a candidate who engaged in the textbook definition of racism and had a long history of anti-black bias. Look, there are multiple reasons why Trump won: a flawed Democratic candidate and low Democratic turnout, the whole email issue, and yes, of course, the economy played a role. But to focus all or most of our attention on income inequality and the left behind real issues which need addressing doesn't tackle the racist elephant in the room. And yes, I accept not all Trump voters are racist, but the racists did vote for Trump. Plus, as one very viral tweet aptly put it, not all Trump supporters are racist, but all of them decided that racism isn't a deal breaker. And so we have a situation where in January, the first black president of the United States will hand over to a president endorsed by the KKK. But apparently it's the economy, stupid. I don't think so. Noam Chomsky, what is your advice in terms of reforms, a US political system that looks broken to a lot of us outsiders? The second time in 16 years, a Republican has been elected to the White House despite winning fewer votes in the country than his Democratic rival. Would you get rid of the Electoral College? Would you abolish it, as many Americans want to see the abolition?
Well, if I could snap my fingers, yes, but it's not going to happen.
But it's not a system you think works?
I don't think it works very well, but there's other problems too. The entire system of apportionment of delegates happens to give extra power to rural areas, which happen to be mostly conservative, Republican. The significance of elections are almost bought. Huge amounts of money go into elections, from the House up to the White House. The representatives, for the majority, in fact, do not represent their constituents. Yeah. If you look at, there have been good studies of the correlations between people's attitudes and the positions taken by their representatives. And for about 70% of the population, there's basically no correlation. These are really serious problems. The American political system happens to be pretty regressive in its structure. That probably wouldn't even be tolerated by the European Court of Justice, and it should be changed, but there are deeper issues.
Of course. You were pretty explicit when I interviewed you earlier this year that progressives should vote against Trump, and if you were in a swing state, you would have voted for Clinton as the lesser of two evils. A lot of progressives didn't agree with you. A lot of young millennials, they voted for third-party candidates like Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, or they stayed at home and didn't turn out, saying Trump, Clinton, what's the difference? They're all the same. What's your message to those voters today who refuse to vote for Trump or refuse to vote to stop Trump? What's your message to them now that he's won and he's in the White House?
Same as before. I think they're making a bad mistake. First of all, there are two issues. One is a kind of a moral issue. Do you vote against the greater evil if you don't happen to like the other candidate? The answer to that is yes, if you have any moral understanding. You want to keep the greater evil out. Second is a factual question. How do Trump and Clinton compare? And I think they're very different. I didn't like Clinton at all, but her positions are much better than Trump's on every issue I can think of.
And I interviewed Slavoj Žižek, the leftist philosopher, Slovenian critic who you've criticized in the past. On this show recently, he said, in a kind of Maoist revolutionary terms, he said, Trump would shake up the system and could end up being a positive force in terms of undermining the status quo. Does he have a point?
A terrible point. It was the same point that people like him said about Hitler in the early 30s.
Because it backfires in the end?
He'll shake up the system in bad ways. What the What it means is now the left, instead of, if Clinton had won, she had some progressive programs. The left could have been organized to keeping her feet to the fire and pushing them through. What it'll be doing now is trying to protect rights that have, and gains that have been achieved from being destroyed. That's completely regressive.
Noam Chomsky, on Barack Obama, the left critique of his foreign policy record has been pretty clear. Escalating in Afghanistan, regime change in Libya, drone strikes in Pakistan, increasing aid to Israel. But there's also been a positive side to his record, surely, as well. The Iran deal, the reopening of with Cuba, the Paris Agreement on climate change, all of which are now at risk from a Trump presidency. Given the arrival of Trump, won't we end up missing Obama? Won't you miss him even a little bit?
Well, the things that you mentioned, like, it's worth talking about them. Obama did move towards normalization of relations with Cuba. The reason is not the one that was given. The reason was the United States was becoming so isolated on the hemisphere that it was on the verge of being literally kicked out of hemispheric meetings. So it was good to make those small steps, much too small. On the climate change issue, the Paris negotiations were a step forward, nowhere near enough, and that's in great danger now. The Iran deal, there's a lot to talk about, but it's better to have the deal than not. And if Trump withdraws from it, could be many things could happen.
So regardless of his intentions, he did make small positive steps, as you say.
There were.
So surely when you look at Donald Trump in the White House, are you going to look back with some fondness on Barack Obama with some hindsight?
Not fondness, but opposition to what Trump will be doing. There are also some very ugly aspects of Obama's policy.
I pointed some of those out, of course.
Well, like the global assassination campaign. That's a form of international terrorism we haven't seen before.
Undoubtedly so. And on Israel, of course, the Obama administration has been accused of being anti-Israel. He's had a personal falling out with Benjamin Netanyahu. But when you look at military aid, it's gone up. When you look at settlements, they've gone up. What is Obama's record on Israel going to be?
Obama's record on Israel was pretty awful, and Trump's is worse, considerably worse. So far, at least, what he and his spokesman have said is that basically the settlements are not an obstacle to peace. They're legal. Go ahead. Israel's already reacting instantly. The Israeli right is overjoyed. They're considering a law that's in the Knesset right now that would legalize retrospectively settlements that even they had regarded are illegal, and looks like carte blanche for the settlement movement. He's also talked about, of course, many presidents talk about moving the capital to Jerusalem.
This one might do it. Just before we finish, Noam Chomsky, on climate change, you've called the Republican Party the most dangerous organization in world history because of their climate denial. What do you say to those on the left who say, look, none of our political leaders or parties are up to the task of tackling climate change, taking it seriously? Clinton would have been no better on climate change than Trump. That's what Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential candidate, said on the show a few months ago. So who cares about the rhetoric? The fact is they're all as bad as each other on climate change.
Which is pure nonsense. Clinton's programs are not good enough, but they're better than Obama's. So, for example, she called for having all U.S. households on renewable energy in 4 years. She supported the international agreements, Paris, and would have supported Marrakesh. The policies are not great, but there's been a considerable reduction. There are regulatory systems which have improved, reduced greenhouse gases. All of this is to the good. Furthermore, she provides a basis for moving on. In the case of Trump, it's radically the opposite.
So let me ask you
radically
this before we
the
finish.
opposite. Take a look at his proposals.
So is it all over now for climate change? Is it too late to stop climate change?
Well, we don't know, but it's certainly a radical setback. In fact, you saw it at Marrakesh. As soon as the election results were announced, the conference basically ended. No substantive results came out. This is a man, and it's not just him, it's the whole Republican Party. Every single candidate in the primaries either said it's not happening or we shouldn't do anything about it. Trump's position is more fossil fuels, eliminate regulations, even coal, refuse the payments, promised payments to countries trying to move to sustainable energy. To claim that this is the same as Clinton's programs is just madness in my view.
Noam Chomsky, thanks for joining me on Upfront.